You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm pretty good, man. It's the end of March, or March is over. March Madness is now over. We have a new NCAA champion on the men's side, and it is Kansas. And I'm a UNC fan. I was a UNC fan for many years, and they got this close, man. They had a 15-point lead going into halftime last night, and they coughed it up. They still had a chance right up into the last play, and didn't make it happen.
Well, I have not followed college basketball at all, so I guess congrats to Kansas. Wasn't it a bigger matchup, though, having Duke and UNC last weekend? Was that like the real championship, or was this? Yeah, okay.
No, definitely. Well, Kansas was the best team, so
were they?
If you look at it from that perspective, they were the best team in the country. What I would say, so the takeaway that I had to apply to IAM, which we should have some kind of takeaway to apply to IAM.
Of course. Everything maps back.
Yes. So it's that, Kansas played this wonderful game, and then on the last, all they had to do was inbound the ball, hold it, get fouled, go to the line, and the game basically would have been done at that point. They had a 3-point lead. Instead, when they inbounded it, the guy who took the ball dribbled, stepped on the out of bounds line with like 3.5 seconds left, turned the ball over to UNC. They got to inbound and take one more shot, which they missed. But all that preparation went into one small mistake. They almost lost the game. So
that stuff drives me crazy. It's just discipline, right? And kind of knowing situational awareness. Where are you at? I mean, this is something like just it bugs me because I see it all the time. Like I'm much more of a fan of the NFL. It's the same thing as like a running back going out of bounds when they're trying to run the clock with less than 2 minutes. I'm like, get tackled in bounds. Like, what are you doing, man? It's like you have one job, and that just drives me crazy. I'm sure in the heat of the moment, it's much more difficult as a armchair quarterback or basketball analyst would probably look at it. But man, that's the kind of stuff. It's like, what's going on? Like, come on, you're better than that.
All that preparation, and it's the big moment, and it cracks anyway. And you see this with information security where, it's like, well, the thing will be like, you'll hear about this major breach that cost the company tens of millions of dollars, and they got in using a contractor account, and the contractor account should have been disabled. And you say, duh, why are you disabling your contractor accounts? You got to remember how many different points of entry there are, and you have the layers of security and all that, and some things sometimes slip through the cracks. I think the most important thing with that, well, maybe it's not the most important thing, but one thing you have to do is be able to detect when you've been breached. You got to be able to identify it quickly and then take action based on that. I mean, that's one of the things we've been talking about, insider threats, a lot over the last few episodes. I think that's a real key is, we see the data. It takes companies hundreds of days to find the attack. And then they're not even confident that they'll be able to determine the full extent of the breach. And I think that's got to be a major focus of IAM programs, is being able to identify when they've been breached and then be able to do the forensics to determine what the extent of the breach is.
Yeah, I think of it. Details matter, discipline matters, and I think I don't know which movie it was, but I think it was Arnold. Like, you lack discipline, right? It's like, if you're running an IAM program, if you're running InfoSec, you have to be disciplined and you have to pay attention to the details. They matter, right? We think about like all the breaches we're having and MFAs being, compromised or bypassed in a bunch of different ways and things like that, where it's like, okay, you can have the best security tools in the world. You can have pretty much everything that you could possibly hope for from a capability standpoint. And then all it takes is just one person to slip up. And, they approve the prompt because they're fatigued with keep getting, MFA prompts, or they get socially engineered or phished or whatever it may be. The bad guys basically have to be right once. The good guys have to be right all the time. And details matter when you're up against those kinds of odds.
Yeah. The other trend that's been on my mind and is that the landscape of IT, automation, DevOps, hybrid cloud is changing the computing landscape, and security people in IAM have to stay up with that. They have to understand it and be able to apply discipline and frameworks to these new models, which hopefully they understand, or hopefully they're getting to understand. But they also have to deal with the fact that some of these automation platforms need to be able to go and create the access that they need. And it's a different paradigm than kind of managing workforce IAM, where it's more of like that ITIL model where, yeah, maybe there's automation up to a certain point, but there's tickets, there's a paper trail, things like that. So it's the game is also changing.
Yeah, game's changing, tools change. I think, especially when you get to the cloud, right? I think sometimes there's this bifurcation of what does IAM look like when you're talking about on-prem versus cloud. And now we're talking about things like AWS roles versus Azure groups versus Google versus Rackspace versus, Oracle. Everybody has like their version of IAM. You got to keep pace with it. I think it's an interesting conversation, and we've certainly had some recent conversations on the DevSecOps side of things. You talk about frameworks, and I think one of the things that I think about from it's not necessarily a framework, but from a capability standpoint is around passwordless, for example. That's something that you and I have been looking at for a while. And that's something that is interesting to me because I see it as something that improves security. It improves usability, and the user experience that goes along with it. And when it's done right, it's almost like Apple, right? It's magic. It just works. But there is still a lot more to it, and making sure that that we get that usability where it needs to be into the hands of the right people.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only just making the authentication layering on top of the password stronger, like adding a code or a one-time password or something like that. It's completely changing that authentication paradigm from knowledge-based to possession-based. And boy, do we have the right guest today to talk about it.
We sure do.
Boy, did we set ourselves up for that or what?
It's almost like we kind of know what we're talking about, where we're going to go with the conversation. But yeah, why don't we go ahead and welcome Andrew Shikiar. He's the executive director of the FIDO Alliance, back for his 4th appearance on the Identity Center podcast. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thank you, Jeff. Jim, great to be with you guys.
Yeah, so this is the 4th time that you've been on the podcast. And here's a little fun fact. I have actually seen you in person more recently than I've seen Jim, which is, I guess, kind of where things are at from a travel perspective.
I'm sorry to hear that. I hope that
It's been a few years, so.
Yeah, it has. I was at Authenticate 2021, which is the conference that Andrew and the FIDO Alliance kind of helped put together, which was awesome, by the way. One of our best and most listens to episodes came out of that week, where I think we recorded 5 episodes in 1 week and kind of put them out every day. So I was kind of like head down, recording and interviewing guests like yourself and others. And then in the hotel room at night, getting the edits cranked out so you can get them published. So it was a good time. And, maybe we'll be able to pull the same thing off later this year at Authenticate 2022, but I don't want to get too far ahead. Why don't we just start off for folks who aren't familiar with FIDO or Fast Identity Online? What is FIDO? Just kind of real quick. Who is this for?
Yeah. So FIDO Alliance is an industry body of around 250 companies worldwide who collaborate on creating open standards for simpler, stronger user authentication. FIDO itself was founded as a body around 9 years ago with the goal of building those standards and seeing them into market. But more simply put, we're trying to create alternatives for user authentication, alternatives to passwords. As you guys were talking about in the intro, passwords and multi-factor authentication. Passwords are inherently risky, and multi-factor authentication for too long has been too difficult. And so our mission as an organization has been to create technology that is both, more secure but also easy to use. And the way we do this, we've created kind of a user-friendly approach to asymmetric public key cryptography. And asymmetric public key cryptography is a mouthful for those outside the industry and for those of us inside the industry. And our belief is that you shouldn't have to be able to say asymmetric public key cryptography, let alone know what it means to use it. And so we've done that by building this technology into devices that are literally at the fingertips of billions of users every moment, every day. So technology has been built into every major web browser, every major operating system, every major platform, such that literally, just about every device that's being unboxed this very moment has support for FIDO authentication built into it.
It'd be really cool to know how many people use FIDO within, let's say, the last few months or something like that, or within the past year. I bet it's approaching 1 billion people, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing about our specifications, our approach is that there's very strong privacy control. So it's really hard for us to actually track that data, which is good by design. But yeah, the billions of devices support FIDO authentication. It's been deployed at scale by companies such as eBay, Microsoft, Google, Twitter, Facebook, leading mobile operators like NTT Docomo, T-Mobile, Verizon, leading banks, Wells Fargo, leading banks like Bank of America, BBVA, and several others have deployed or are deploying. So yeah, there's a pretty good chance that people are leveraging FIDO and they might not know it. Because the way this all works, it actually sits underneath the authentication or the device unlock function of your device, right? So if you're using Face ID or Touch ID or Windows Hello, that's how you unlock your device. But underneath that sits the private key in the FIDO key pair, right? So it's protected by that local verification action with the public key sitting on the server. And so yes, people are probably using FIDO. They just don't know it right now. We haven't focused on becoming a consumer brand. It's this underlying functionality, kind of like, a great analogy is SSL, right? Before SSL was out there, how did you have, how'd you know you're having protected, encrypted, privacy secure dialogue on the web? SSL kind of standardized that. Ultimately, it was built into every browser, every communication, such that you don't necessarily look for like the lock in your browser bar because it's there. And so that's our goal, is to become that pervasive, but for user authentication.
So Andrew, I've got a tough question for you. We're still seeing breaches take place. In a lot of cases, they've got MFA in place. We had Roger Grimes on the show back on episode 109. Roger also spoke at the Authenticate 2021 conference. Jeff had a chance to talk quantum computing with him, totally unrelated to my question, right? But the idea is that MFA exists. Not only exists, but is in place when breaches are actually still taking place. So, what's the deal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, let me start with my standard disclaimer that any form of MFA is better than a password alone, right? If you have a password alone, you need to layer up. The vast majority of scalable, like remote attacks, can be thwarted with any form of MFA. Now, that being said, not all MFA is created equal, which is why we're seeing more and more MFA bypass attacks. In fact, I've been on record, and I'll say it again until I'm blue in the face. 2022 is going to be the year of MFA bypass attacks. And the reason being is that legacy forms of multi-factor authentication share more in common with passwords than they don't. And the main thing they're sharing is most of it is knowledge based, something right? So you think about the most common form of MFA is an SMS OTP. OTP, one-time passcode. It's really not that different than a password, other than the fact that it has a shorter lifespan. But it's still something that the user has to know and has to enter into their device, send it over the wire to then land in a server where the server can recognize it and then grant access. What do you do with a password? It's something it's something you enter in a device, something that goes over the wire and then lands on a server. It doesn't land, but that the server ingests it. The threat of both those things is that a remote attacker can get themselves in the middle of this. So man in the middle attack, machine in the middle attack. With either scenario, all they're doing is pretending to be that website and relaying the real information back to the real website. The user has no idea. The user thinks they're talking to, say, bank.com, but they didn't notice that in the URL, it's like bank with 2Ks.com. And it looks just as real as the real bank.com website. And they're getting OTP prompts because what happens is the machine in the middle gets a prompt from the real site, realbank.com. They send them back on to the user. The user does her part by entering the OTP code, and the machine in the middle is literally relaying this information back and forth, taking over the account. And this is becoming more and more common, Jim, as you point out. In fact, there are like commercially supported toolkits on the dark web that you can buy with like customer support to help you launch a MFA, bypass attack for like $20. So not only is it possible, it's becoming like commercially viable for people to launch these attacks. And my concern with this, first of all, is that, this is happening. But secondly, part of our mission this year and working, with partners, inside the Alliance, outside the Alliance, is for people to understand there's a clear delineation between this form of legacy MFA, which by and large is possession-based or relying on human judgment. Excuse me. The legacy MFA is knowledge-based or relying on human judgment versus possession-based, modern multi-factor authentication, which is where you need to be in possession of that device, take action on that device, to, allow for cryptographic exchange of keys, to allow for secure user authentication. And that cannot be spoofed.
I want to go back to that point that you were making there, because I want to put an exclamation point on it. In this man in the middle attack, it does not take a PhD in computer science to pull one of these things off. You mentioned the commercially available support. Roger talked about a program, I think it's open source pretty much, Evil Jinx. You look at Lapsus, what's happened is these aren't, the PhDs in computer science. They're teenagers who are running these major hacks and causing these major issues. The Evil Jinx is a, an instantiation of exactly what you described, which is a website that looks completely legitimate because it's basically just taking the HTML and is capturing and relaying that information. And by the way, the whole thing has already been written by somebody else. So basically you have to know how to install the software in order to pull this thing off. And then you fish people to come to your site and attempt to log in. So
that's exactly it.
The reason I wanted to put the exclamation point is we're not talking about something like, oh, that'll never happen to me. It could.
Yeah. And look, and the fact of the matter is a well-designed phishing attack. So not like your like Nigerian prince, scheme, but a well-designed phishing attack that actually, replicates the website in a reasonable fashion, has a good looking email, the spear phishing attack, has over a 40% success rate. Not a click rate, a success rate of you being phished, right? And so well-designed, MFA bypass attack will probably have a similar rate as well. And we've seen like very meaningful hacks happen this year with MFA bypass. So, Singapore over like the start of the year after the Christmas season, OCBC Bank had a major issue where someone, overtook the SMS channel and basically pretended to be a bank. And if I'm the bank customer, I see this thing from my bank saying, oh, geez, my account's been compromised. Send me your SMS code, your OTP code, the authentication app. I think they're using the app, TOTP. They'd send that code. The person would take over their account. It's happening it's happening with regularity on crypto exchanges. And Jim, to your point, these aren't like, PhDs with hoodies sitting in a dark corner somewhere. These are teenage kids. Like more recently, or actually not more recently, a little further back, the Twitter hack that happened, in fall 2020, this was a social engineering attack. Right? They called in and got the information of some admins at Twitter and said, hey, we need you to, I forget exactly what the dialogue was, but they basically got those network admins to give their authentication codes, their second factor codes to the hacker. They then use it to take over accounts of like major political figures. And thank goodness they were just up to no good. Like imagine like had they actually tweeted some dangerous stuff from those powerful people, we could have had a real situation on our hand. But let me tell you something, had those, network admins had like a FIDO security key in their hand or something like that, where they couldn't actually relay that information on to the fake, the fake IT person, that access could not have been granted, right? So that's a fundamental difference between possession-based approach to authentication and knowledge-based. And it's not just, I should note, it's not just like only knowledge-based factors like OTPs. The Lapsus hack, if I'm not mistaken, some of that was done with like device prompt fatigue, where you're basically sending, push notifications to approve an MFA, login to a device until a person just hits yes, because people are inclined to do a couple things. I'm a big believer in humanity. I'm pretty much an optimist, other than when it comes to my sports teams. But like for human nature, I believe in we are all well-intended people. We try to make the right decisions 95% of the time. We do our best to do the right thing. And what phishers do and what hackers do, they take advantage of that, right? They take advantage of our trust. And so, yes, a sloppy phishing email is one way of doing it, but, using social engineering to get someone to give you secret information about the account you're taking over is another way of doing that. Right? Customer support literally wants to support you as a customer, but instead, due to all these attacks, we're asking them to also, your customer support team, you're asking them to become like your shadow IT teams, or worse yet, asking your customers to figure out if an email is a phishing attack or not. So people should just want to, people should be allowed to stay in their lanes. I'm not saying we should, should encourage people to bury their heads in the sand, but customers should be customers. Customer support should be customer support. If we put the better tools in place to allow systems and people to protect themselves from themselves, I think we'll see a lot of these problems go away.
Well, I think that shift to possession-based authentication, as you've described it, versus knowledge-based is really where FIDO plays in. And I think of the scenarios with like the fatigue around MFA prompts, right? That's a real thing. Like it may sound silly to people. It's like, what do you mean you pressed yes on the thing that you weren't expecting? People will do it. People are doing it. So that is an issue. And I think about this from a usability standpoint. I'm sure this is something that comes up in conversations with, some of the partners over on the FIDO Alliance, but how does that user experience get better? How do we make this easier for people to take advantage of, the capabilities that they do already have in their hands, whether it's an iPhone or an Android or Windows Hello or, a YubiKey or whatever it might look like, from a device standpoint? How does that user experience improve, or how can it get better?
Yeah. So, I want to address that. I just want to make one last point on the MFA bypass thing, because it's really important for people to understand. This is my biggest fear, is that if you read about an MFA bypass attack or you see an MFA was overcome, that doesn't mean that MFA doesn't work. Okay. That means you need to think closer about the MFA that you're going to implement moving forward. And so there are, solutions ready to implement, such as using FIDO security keys, which are tokens, or FIDO platform authenticators, or other non-FIDO approaches that leverage public key cryptography, which will work better than legacy MFA. So don't be discouraged by MFA bypass attacks. Take it as a call to action to implement modern multi-factor authentication. And as part of that, user experience is absolutely critical. FIDO's tagline is simpler, stronger authentication. That's what we aim to do. As I mentioned in the outset, we've made amazing progress in seeing FIDO built into platforms and devices worldwide. And because of that, we've seen some very big implementations, right? We often point to eBay. eBay.com is a great example of FIDO being used at scale to protect all of those customers who are choosing to log in using a platform authenticator rather than a password. But getting there is actually quite difficult. When I say platform authenticator, I'm talking about your biometric on your handset, or you're on your PC, or Touch ID on your MacBook. But actually, while the technology is built in, getting people to take those behaviors is somewhat challenging. And we've heard this from our constituents. We've heard this from our stakeholders. And so we have to do a couple of things to look at usability. First, we're actually just taking it on. So last year, we released the first ever UX guidelines, user experience guidelines, for FIDO authentication, for the specific use case of how to implement FIDO most effectively when using a PC or laptop. And so we did, very extensive research. We hired an expert UX firm. We tested 3 sets of tests, both qualitative and quantitative, asking people how they felt about different types of prompts, different types of UX, icon flows, studying their reaction, both moderated and unmoderated, to come up with these guidelines. And, through that, we charted the entire user journey from initial prompt to enroll FIDO authentication on through to authentication, log out, and sign back in. And so this body of work was rolled into a document and actually a live website. Behind that, we launched a reference site. So we have a reference implementation with what we see as a data-driven best practice for implementing FIDO for desktop authenticators. And that's all live on our website with a link that Jeff, I'll send it for you to share. So that's one thing we did. And, the response to that was so positive, we've actually instituted that into the way we operate as an alliance. So recently we launched what we call a UX committee. So not to get into the inner workings of standards organization, but this is a board committee. So the highest level committee you could have in the alliance, comprised of expert designers, like capital D designers and UX people. And these are, what you picture designers to look like, very cool, kind of edgy people who know how to design things really well, but they're weighing in on all things FIDO. All right. So what should our specs consider about UX when, as they're being developed? How should our documentation contemplate guiding people to implement things in a more usable way? What future research should FIDO do, to build off the UX guidelines effort that we've done? There's several projects this committee is taking on. I think it's very important, and it's going to really have a lot of positive impacts on the broader marketplace to help people be more successful in implementing authentication in a way that's intuitive and ready to be consumed by consumers, which is absolutely critical. So that's one thing we've done. Now, beyond that, there are things we need to do on the specification side. And very recently, we issued a paper talking about the concept of multi-device FIDO credentials. And this fundamentally kind of expands the approach that FIDO has taken towards meeting our goal of reducing industry reliance on passwords. So one usability issue that has persisted that we hear from relying parties about is the need for their consumers and their customers to enroll each device that they use for their FIDO accounts, if you will. Right. So part of the security benefit of FIDO is that the private key stays on the device. That helps give greater confidence to the relying party that is a user on the registered device. That's a very good thing. But the problem is if you then go to log in that same account with another device, you need to then re-enroll the private key on that next device. So that definitely has a very high security factor. That's why it's the gold standard in security. But there's some unintended usability and security impacts of that approach as well. So from a usability standpoint, again, one needs to basically register each device again when they get a new device. I just got a new handset, so I had to do this dozens of times, which is inconvenient, but not unmanageable, but very inconvenient. But the other thing it does, it makes the service provider keep a password on their server, because how am I going to enroll? So some people do other ways of sending SMS codes, which are better than a password marginally, or there's other ways of kind of triangulating that I am who I say I am. But for the long tail of the vast majority of service providers, the easiest thing to do is just keep that password on the server. And so then what are we really doing at that point? Right? We're not really taking massive strides towards taking passwords off of servers and breaking the cycle of credential theft, credential stuffing, and remote attacks. We're perpetual, right? So we think that by enabling this approach towards multi-device FIDO credentials, not only will it create a better user experience where that user can just have a kind of password manager-like experience, but with FIDO key pairs instead of passwords, but additionally, it will really help accelerate the movement away from passwords altogether for the for the vast majority of consumer service providers.
So I think that approach is helpful, especially for someone like me who tends to use a lot of devices and is always trying something new. I guess the question I would have then is, if I have multiple devices and multiple authentications or authentication devices, now possession-based authentication devices, I guess who's keeping track of that? Do I keep track of that in some sort of like wallet that I have? Or are the IDPs that are, acting as the providers for the services out there keep track of it? I guess where is the record that says, oh, Jeff
Yeah.
has an iPhone and an Android phone and an iPad and a Mac and a Surface or something like that?
Yeah. So this really relies heavily on the platform providers and the device platform providers. So Apple, Google, and also like Microsoft for the Windows environment. So you can leverage. In fact, Apple announced this vision at WWDC 2021. They announced something they call passkeys, which is basically, if you think for anyone who's an Apple user, you're familiar with iCloud Keychain, which is basically their password manager. But the beauty of iCloud is that it's easy to use, and I have it on my my iPhone. I just updated my iPhone. I logged on to iCloud, and everything comes down. Likewise, if I'm using iCloud across my devices, the keychain stores all my passwords across those devices. So it's basically leaning on the authentication and security schemes of Apple to protect that user's information. So there's a big lean on the platform providers. Likewise, Google would then implement a similar vision with Android if they went down this path, and Microsoft would do the same thing on Windows, and other people could do on their own operating systems as well. Now, as part of this expanded vision that we detailed the other week, there's a corollary piece to it, which is allowing for easier Bluetooth pairing between devices, right? So while you can imagine each of these kind of platform clouds being where the private key is synced, essentially. How do you get across clouds? Right, it's a good question, and so we see Bluetooth pairing as a good way of doing that. Right, so it needs to be proximity, so it improves proximity, so it takes away the remote attacks. But basically, you can use your iPhone to bootstrap your Android device or your PC to allow for that local authentication then to happen on that device, and then you're set to go in that environment. So I think the combination of these things allows for a very secure and user-friendly way of allowing more secure access to systems and services using FIDO key pairs rather than password. That works both on an initial platform cloud, but also eventually across different operating environments.
I think it's a real interesting approach to try and solve that problem. And I'm totally with the idea of making this easy for people, and for people who are iPhone or Apple fans, right? They're probably a bottom of the ecosystem. Then you've got other people, and I'm just pontificating here, so no response needed. But I'm thinking here of people who are cross-device, and I never thought that I would say this, at least not 10 years ago. But it seems to me like Microsoft has started to position themselves as neutral between iOS and Android, for example. And I think when I think of possession-based authentication, I think of, okay, it's either an iPhone or an Android phone. Those are probably the two things that are most common out there. And the one company that is straddling both is Microsoft with their Authenticator app. I could very much see a scenario where you're essentially having to trust Microsoft, which I'm sure not everyone does. But there now is an option as an app that runs on either device or maybe both devices, and you can have kind of that duality that people and nerds like me like technology and will use multiple flavors. OSs could potentially straddle the line where they're not all in on Apple, or they're not all in on Google and Android, for example.
Yeah. And then I think that, with any new kind of innovation in our specifications, we'll see, industry innovate on top of that. Right. So one thing that's been really fun to see inside of FIDO Alliance is the pace of innovation within our community and the pace of competition as well. Right. So we have a very vibrant kind of startup ecosystem of companies here work with our technologies to do, purpose-built products and solutions or end-to-end platforms, with kind of brave new ideas. So I have little doubt that we'll see some innovation on top of this concept as well, not just by the big platforms, but by third parties. And one other thing that's important to note as we talk about this concept is that this isn't like a pivot to this multi-device FIDO credentials. It's basically an expansion of what we're doing, right? So in my view, the gold standard for FIDO authentication, the gold standard from a security standpoint, will always be a device-bound credential, whether it's a security key or platform authenticator, where that key is not leaving that device, right? But you can still do that, right? So you don't need to rely on the platform. You don't need to, require a sync key. The relying party can choose to support either mechanism that they wish. Our belief, though, is that the vast majority, if you think about the number of passwords you need to create and enter in a day of your life or in a week of your life, especially if you do something different, like you go on vacation, it's staggering. And most of those sites probably, will be happy to just use a better authentication mechanism that, is built into the platforms of their users.
I think you're touching on such a important topic, and I've done strategy development for many companies with an online customer-facing presence and face the marketing or quote-unquote business side of the house, where it's like we cannot make authentication difficult. And so we go to the least common denominator. What is a very short password, something that's very easy to remember, the least hurdle so that people can get in and spend money. I want to also juxtapose that with kind of, as when I think of the major platforms that I see associated with FIDO 2 standard, it's Microsoft, Google, Apple. And when I look at companies, it's companies like Visa, it's major e-commerce platforms. So who is FIDO for? Is it for the company that has a smaller web presence? Can they do FIDO as well? Do they need to align with the major technology vendor? What's available to them?
Yep, great question. Anyone can use FIDO, right? So it's open technology, open standards. So like if you just want to like enable, passwordless second factor login or even primary, login, you can use the WebAuthn protocol and build that into your website. And it's all open source. There's open technology. There's a lot of open source frameworks out there. We do a lot of work with the W3C WebAuthn community adoption group and trying to enable some of this. So if you're like a Go developer, whatever your favorite web framework is, you can actually, probably implement WebAuthn using that framework. And so that's one way of doing it. There's also, I mentioned before, the pace of innovation, and how we're seeing different companies in the FIDO ecosystem create solutions for different market segments. All right. So every vendor, of course, they want to land the bank with 100 million customers. But there's a lot of companies out there. We're seeing a lot of vendors who are creating solutions for SMBs or like API first things for developers. So if you're a small shop and you have a web developer, you can use one of these, very developer centric platforms to very seamlessly build FIDO authentication flows into your web environment. And in that scenario, you're only paying for what you use. So I think we're seeing, depending on what one's use case is, there are solutions out there ranging from just writing to the specs on through to developer frameworks on through to actual appliances. We have a company selling appliances for SMBs that want to be do on-prem user authentication, employee authentication. That's an option too. So I know it's kind of a vague answer, Jim, but
no, it's a very good answer.
Yes.
And what it makes me think about is kind of leading into my next question, which is going to change topics. So it's kind of like the education is out there. Unfortunately, I had to watch the Authenticate 2021 conference from my computer because I thought I had COVID. I was sick. I was like on the borderline. So Jeff and I were supposed to go and present something on passwordless, and Jeff went and did it without me. Good job,
and
Jeff.
I'm never going to let that one go. This was your idea. And yeah, the morning of the flight, you better stay home.
I gave you plenty of notice.
You missed out.
You didn't want me there, right? You didn't want me breathing the
That's
same
true. Nobody
air
wants
as
to
you.
be next to the guy coughing, sneezing, and especially at that time of where things were at in the world. So yeah, you should have stayed home, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to give you crap about it every once in a while.
Yeah, and I can live with that. So I mean, the conference was a great way to educate yourself and see what other people are doing and see how that, because I feel like there's so many IAM practitioners out there, security people in companies who are facing the same challenge that I talked about with that, the marketing team, that they just want the people to be able to go in and do business and not have their user experience turn people away from going on and conducting business with them. We all get that, but it's a balance, right? You gotta you've got to do so in a secure way. So I'm not going to beat that to death. But what I did want to talk to you about or ask you about is, the FIDO Alliance is doing a lot of great things, including the conference. Maybe talk to us a little bit about what you're looking forward to with the rest of 2022.
Yeah. So, Authenticate is going to be kind of a another kind of major moment for FIDO Alliance. And Jim, we're sorry we're not there last year. We're happy to have Jeff, but having one of you was only half as good as both of you. And I got to say, Authenticate 21 was really kind of it was an inspiring moment. One of the cool things, one of the things I feel very privileged about in my job is the ability to actually, engage with the broader community. Thinks that, reducing reliance on passwords is a bad thing. By and large, people are behind what we're trying to do. There isn't any sort of competing initiative to FIDO Alliance. And so we have a lot of, very positive contributions and goodwill in our community, and almost like a missionary kind of feel to what's happening here. People understand the importance of what we're trying to do. They want to contribute. And I think it's reflected in what we saw at Authenticate conference last year, which is where, despite all the COVID challenges, and the day-to-dayness of it all, like we didn't know week to week what was going to happen. But we still managed to have over 250 people, attend in person, which exceeded our expectations. And we had, 2.5 days of awesome content. And the whole thing was great. It's really good to see the community come together. I think there's real appetite for people to meet in person. One of my favorite things I think about are just the hallway conversations you'd see. Like 3 people huddled around like a tall table, like writing on paper and are mapping out different things. That's the way that people are meant to collaborate. And I thought that was really cool. So as we look forward to Authenticate 2022, more of that. And hopefully January going to be there this time too. So we're hoping to have over 400 people show up. We just closed our call for papers. That being said, if any of your listeners, have an idea they want to submit and speak on, and it's really compelling, we could probably find a way to get it in front of our program committee. But it's been interesting watching the call for speakers responses. And so I think last year we had around 2.5 times as many responses as we had spots on our physical agenda. This year, we had around a 30% increase or 40% increase in submissions, which is great. So we have, probably 4 times as many submissions as we have spots, which is a good problem to have. But the other thing I note is that just looking at the titles of the submissions, and I haven't dug into all the abstracts yet, but looking at the titles, it shows a maturation in the marketplace. Whereas a couple of years ago, when we were fully virtual and we did it the first time, we had a lot of kind of general things like, why is FIDO better than passwords? Well, not quite that basic, but pretty basic. Go to the password list with FIDO authentication. Whereas now we're getting some very specific, use case specific submissions. Like, how do you deploy FIDO in a, native environment, like a clean room environment? How do you deploy FIDO for, government employees? And so actual, use case driven submissions where people will share their experiences, with each other. So I'm super excited to see that all come together. That also taps into what I was talking about before, kind of the sense of community. It's very unique to have a technology where people are willing to share what they've done to be successful. They're sharing, not just with their friends, but potentially with competitors. Right. So I think there's this general awareness that, by collaborating together and finding better ways to do this, that we will create a better kind of network economy for everyone to take part in. So super excited for Authenticate. I'd encourage you guys both to come and your listeners to come as well. We'll be opening registration on June 1, most likely, right around then. So that will be certainly a big moment for us in 2022. Other than that, we talked about the multi-device FIDO credentials. That's going to be a headline for us in 2022. as we work to extend the usability of FIDO. We'll continue to educate the market on the difference between legacy MFA and FIDO MFA. And then one other initiative, which is worth highlighting amongst other things that we're doing, is the FIDO Certified Professional Program. So we announced this actually at Authenticate 2021, and this will be live for, the testing will go live around, I'm going to pre-announce it now, around April 12th. I think April 12th or April 13th. April 12th, by the way, is Identity Management Day. April 13th is my birthday. So either one of those is a good day for it to land on. But most importantly, this is a program targeted at professionals who are seeking to deploy FIDO. So really, we're looking at technology architects, security professionals, identity professionals, sysops engineers. Our goal is to help more of these people understand how to deploy FIDO authentication inside their enterprise. And we launched this initiative. We built this whole certification program and testing scheme over the course of the past 2 years, based on feedback from our vendor community. What they were seeing with their customer base was a customer base that wanted to deploy FIDO and they're happy to license their software, but didn't necessarily have the technical experts inside their companies to implement as quickly and as successfully as possible. So our hope is that this builds a broader base of employees and of professionals who can successfully deploy FIDO in a variety of environments, both inside the enterprise, the consumers, and other scenarios as well. So very excited to see that go live in the next week or so.
Andrew, a little side question on the certification. I just want to get your candid feedback on this. Do you think if somebody who is a consultant who had the right background and got certified with the FIDO certification professional program, that they would be in high demand?
I do. I think identity professionals are in high demand. So we partner with ID Pro, like they're certified. The CID Pro program is wonderful. It's certified identity, I think certified ID Pro. So
Certified
this is similar
identity professional. Yep.
So similar vein to that, right? So documenting your expertise in this space, which is very much in demand, right? I mean, if you look at all the impacts of COVID-19, one impact that it had undeniably was it accelerated a lot of companies' digitalization plans and digital transformation plans. And key to digital transformation is, security and authentication and identity. And so there's a huge demand out there for identity professionals and people who know authentication in and out. So yes, we do think that this will be a competitive, a personal competitive differentiator for those who are certified and seeking to find employment or otherwise monetize the fact that they've taken the time to be certified.
Well, I'm interested in having it, see it when it comes out. I think this is something that's going to be really good for people who are looking for identity credentials to, add another thing to their title. People who collect the sort of things, this would be a good thing. I'm always in favor of having more options when it comes to being certified, whatever that means in the identity space, right? Because there's a lot of spaces for that. I know we're running short on time and I want to, let you get on with your day. So we're going to start to kind of wrap things up here. But I've got an offbeat question for you. Totally not identity related. Would you rather be Batman or Spider-Man?
Batman or Spider-Man? Okay. So I think Batman. I don't know either character that well, but I know a couple things. Batman has a cool house, a cool car, and he's not a spider. I'm kind of an arachnophobe. So I think I'd probably have all sorts of self-hate and loathing if I was Spider-Man, or have all sorts of issues. I'd spend more time with my therapist than actually solving crimes and saving the world. So I'm much better off as a bat than a spider.
I think you check the boxes on that one. Yeah. Cool car, cool house, not a spider. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Bats are okay.
Bats are cool.
Bats are cool.
That's what I'm like. Look, bats are neat. Like if you guys are to spend time in Austin or Sydney, Australia. Austin, of course, has a bats under the bridge, but Sydney, down by the I think Victorian Gardens there, at dusk, what do they call them? They call them flying foxes. Like these bats are like everything in Australia. They're big and crazy. Not our Australian friends, but animal wise. flying foxes is quite a sight at night. They come out and they're literally like foxes with wings at dusk, like covering the sky. So yeah, I'm cool with bats, not so much with spiders.
Jim, how about yourself? Batman or Spider-Man?
So yeah, I think with Batman, you should have to specify which Batman.
Well, what do you mean which Batman? What's your choice?
You got like the 60s, or maybe, I don't know what, the TV series that was
Legacy Batman.
Legacy Batman, yeah. And then you had different, like Michael Keaton played Batman and a few other people. It's kind of like James Bond. Like you can't just say, I wish I was James Bond. You have to pick which James Bond you want to be.
Well, I guess you could do the same thing on Spider-Man. I mean, there's, the old Spider-Man live action, which people like to poke fun at. I think there's the Italian version, which if you have not seen the Italian version of Spider-Man, please do look that up on YouTube. So you can choose.
I'm just going to say Bruce Wayne. I mean, he had a butler. I could definitely use the help of a butler right about now. My house needs to be cleaned, and that's what I'm going to be doing tonight. So Bruce Wayne and Batman is my vote. And by the way, I like neither bats nor spiders. I don't want to be near either one.
But you do like cool, clean houses and cars. I think this is a clean slate for Batman because I'm definitely a Batman guy. Obviously the gadgets, the toys, all that stuff. I'm in for that. So I guess Batman takes it 3-0. Sorry, Spider-Man, you lose on this one. All right, let's start to wrap things up. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. Any kind of quick final thoughts that you want to throw out there for the folks who are listening, as we kind of gotten this update from kind of where FIDO is, and also talk about sort of what people should be thinking about when it comes to MFA bypass and how we're going to start to guard against that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered on a lot of issues today, but yeah, so a couple key takeaways. Again, implement modern multi-factor authentication, right? Possession-based FIDO authentication. There are tons of resources out there, tons of different options for how you could deploy this, depending on your scenario, your technology choices. We have a lot of resources on our FIDOalliance.org website. And if anyone needs like personal guidance or wants to reach out, you can certainly get in touch with me, and I'm happy to connect you with the right resources inside our broader community. So do that. Come to Authenticate. We will be there. We will have a great conference this year. Not only is there going to be awesome content, but we're going to have an amazing party at the end of it at the Jimi Hendrix Museum, which is called the MoPop, Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle. So we had it there last year. This year we're going to have a live band, all sorts of, for anyone who likes music or pop culture, this is a great place to be, with lots of food and drinks to help enjoy yourself. So yeah, come to Authenticate, come engage with the broader identity community at Authenticate, and we'll look forward to seeing people there.
Yeah, that's very cool. I definitely recommend Authenticate. It was my first one there last year, and I'm definitely going to try and make it back again this year. And we'll have a whole bunch of links in our show notes to FIDO Alliance and to be able to connect with Andrew as well through LinkedIn, but also the FIDO Certified Professional Program and the UX guidelines, which I did look up. Quick side note, I know we were talking earlier about it, but the attention to detail is something we kind of led off with. And I noticed even in the UX guidelines, using the correct biometric images based on the flavor of the OS, for example. So I was like, all right, cool. Definitely that attention to details there. So
yeah,
nice job by the team. Jim, how about yourself? Any final thoughts for this week?
I'll keep it brief. Just connect, like the podcast, give us a review if you can. I would also say connect to Andrew via LinkedIn. He's a great person to have in your network. That six degrees of separation. He's definitely connected to a lot of important people, and he can be a great resource to you.
That'd be interesting to see that up on maybe Authenticate, some sort of web of interconnectivity, who knows who, and just how close is the IAM community? Because I feel like it's getting smaller and smaller from a community standpoint. We're all in there.
Great idea.
All right. I think that's a good spot. We can go ahead and leave this week. As Jim mentioned, if you like what you heard, be sure to, hit the thumbs up or the follow or the 5-star or whatever. If you hate it, send it to somebody you don't like. Either way, as long as people are listening, we're cool with that. Check us out on the web at idacpodcast.com. We're on Twitter at idacpodcast. And we've also started to do live streams on YouTube, which you can find at idac.live. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks for being part of this, Andrew and Jim, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.